where the proofing do current tillage-based practices offer to agriculture. This is the conventional land preparation. Typical, different power sources, but essentially pulverizing the soil, and exposed soils are the common sort of scene. And eventually we get loss of organic matter, loss of pore structure, and leading to compaction, and eventually more and more destruction of the biological life and processes. This is at the extreme end in Europe, say for example. And we have these things. I mean, I'm always amazed when Hilary Benn, when he was Secretary of State in DEFRA, he launched the soil strategy for England in Rothamsted because he said we need more research. Rothamsted hardly does any research on soil, but never. He said we need more research. He went to Rothamsted. Behind him was this big reversible plow at the press release. On the right is LEAF, linking environment and farming. This is their soils bulletin. And it says 6 simple steps to your soil to help improve performance. And this is the photograph. And I would like to ask LEAF, how will that soil stay there? But this is what is on that cover page. I wouldn't drive with my car on this landscape. But underneath we have all this. Compaction, and of course that compaction every year has to oh, is that not loud enough? And of course, this is a picture of 5 years of no-till on the left and conventional tillage on the right. You get basically total collapse. And this is how it is. On the left you have, say, if there was a healthy soil, you would have about 50 to 60% pore space. Under the tillage system, you basically end up just about every year until you wake it up, you get about 10, 20% pore space left. You have a seal at the top. So we are pretty good at abusing our soil. And then this is what we get. An expert says that African soils are self-sealing. The trouble is that we make them self-sealing. We seal them. And then there is problem at germination. This is Switzerland. We get ponding in tillage soil. This is Germany. This farm has been sending sediment into that reservoir for many, many years. He gets single farm payment for it as well. Nobody knows. Nobody sees it. But that's what happens as a result of tillage. Organisms, pesticide, fertilizer, all pouring into that reservoir. And I hope they don't drink that water. And of course we know about carbon burning through tillage. Decomposition rates jump to 10%, 12% with heavy tillage. And of course you get wind erosion. And you got, these are European pictures of erosion, massive erosion taking place now, and more. Even if you look at Tiber, River Tiber still pouring out sediment into the sea. Ostia used to be a resort, sea resort in the days of Caesar, but it's now 5 kilometers inland. And this is a picture taken by Thorenson 25 years ago in Paraná Basin, and this is not tea flowing down the river. It's millions of tons of topsoil going over the edge. And when you measure nitrate and phosphorus content of the water, every time you till, it jumps up. So there's a relationship. On the 16th of February, this is the image, satellite image of Britain, sending out sediment plumes, because you all heard about the floods in the UK in February. But look at the amount of sediments which are going out. This is all good topsoil, English topsoil, going out into the sea. So this problem is everywhere, but on top of all that, we now have cropping systems, whether it is in the developing world, and especially in the developed world or industrialized world, tending towards more and more monocropping, or where there is diversity. Even in the developing world, the Tanzanian farmers said we do not have a system in place. We might have maize, we might have cowpea, we might have pigeon pea, but he says now with CA, Sasa nayo umpangalio. He said, I have a system. So we basically have have situations where we're not really aligned to our multiple objective, even at the farm level, let alone at the landscape level and the community level. And I must admit, we're still hearing that intensification can just somehow just take place by putting in inputs and you get more output. Systems development is still not the normal language of discussion. But I think that what we've got now is still, and in Europe certainly, there is excessive amount of application of agrochemicals. The agronomy is fixed, and resilience is built mainly in the genetics of the crop. So we have consequences of what our current systems offer. And we've all heard this is a long list of damage. What's happening? Long list of damage which we keep imposing on our soil. But at the end, we basically reduce resilience and sustainability, poor adaptability to climate variability, and we now have higher production costs. And I will say this even in the developing world. To develop things, we somehow have a model which just is too expensive, too damaging, too degrading. And of course, it leads to dysfunctional ecosystem, dysfunctional water cycle, and we have suboptimal water provisioning and regulating water services. These are all directly linked to weatherproofing and climate proofing of agriculture, landscape, and any sector. So, and this is what we got. We've got now massive degradation worldwide, and Montgomery has captured it very well in his book, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization. So what does conservation agriculture offer in terms of adaptability? Ideally, what we now are basically saying that we want to be able to enhance productivity. We need to be able to do that without destroying ecosystem services, or without ignoring ecosystem services. In other words, we want a lot of ecosystem services alongside being able to enhance, depending on the economics, productivity. But we also simultaneously, as Pat was saying, we want decent efficiency all the time. We cannot continue to waste and have this simple input-output model which just no longer serves a purpose, and especially for the future. And we really need to use as much biodiversity as possible to give us the resilience we need. And in such a way that the systems contribute to our multiple objectives. But also we have a big rehabilitation job to be done. You take India, 35 million hectares of wasteland. These were agricultural land. So, and we see this everywhere. Wasteland turning up, eventually farmers abandoning. So we have a big rehabilitation job to be done of not only productivity, but of ecosystem services as well. What does CA actually offer us? I think we need to realize that these three so-called principles, one way of considering them is that they basically offer us ecological foundation of sustainable agriculture. These are the foundation, dynamic biological foundation for our production system. It's like building a house. You can have a great bungalow or a townhouse, high-riser. Without a foundation, you know that is not climate-proofed. It's just not proofed in any sense. It will crumble. So with CA, we basically can regard that these three principles are essentially beyond just a simple input. These are underpinnings of sustainability. It makes economic sustainability possible. I like to think that economic sustainability is an overlay, is not sort of circles. No, you need a foundation first, and we get that with the three principles of CA. You can then have a more optimum integrated pest management, more optimum integrated water management, or nutrient management, which has been kicking around for 20 years. Without that foundation, integrated nutrient management means very little. It just means mixing up and have a narrative. But the beauty of these three principles are that you can underpin any land-based production system, whether it is arable, agroforestry, horticulture, plantation, crop livestock systems, even say as slash and mulch, and permaculture. At the heart of permaculture is conservation agriculture. So this is what you get, that you can get systems, and even organic agriculture. I'm not very convinced that organic agriculture is, tillage-based organic agriculture is sustainable. I don't think it is. But you put it over a CA base, then I think we're getting somewhere with sustainability. And we have these kinds of pictures that we have a spiral, we can develop a spiral of regeneration, especially with these CA principles, if we put them into practice with locally formulated practices, working together in a synergistic way. So this is what CA begins to look like, from hand systems to manual system to simple mechanized system. And this is what we get instead of self-sealing soil, okay? This is a picture from Christian Thierfelder. You see on the top, we see this, and we have a lady or a farmer shuffling topsoil. Underneath there is a plow pan, not a plow pan, hoe pan. Yeah, underneath is a hoe pan. You break that hoe pan on the right, and you get basically water cycle beginning to refunction again. But if you don't, you get flooding on the left. And of course people say, and because water doesn't want to go in, an expert will say, tie your ridges. And that's the right practice, tie your ridges. And you know, and sweet potato has to be grown on ridges. And you say, why? If you've got a normal soil, breathing soil, nice spongy soil, it accommodates cassava, sweet potato quite well. This is again a picture which I showed you on the right, and now on the left, the same place, no till, and you get water cycling working away. Infiltration, high rates, over 100 millimeter per hour with no till, and down to 20, right down to 0. I keep measuring 0 infiltration rates in many soils, with dusty top layer, and underneath there's a hoe pan, and I measured this in just about every situation, many situations. Right, so response strategies or adaptation, you want increased resilience. I think we need to keep systems diversified. We need to be able to have more timely operation, and CA offers you that. To get our co-evolved relationship, symbiotic relationship, back into function. Symbiotic relationship, including endophytic symbiotant, can bring in a lot of resistance of all kinds, including rust, rust in wheat, which is devastating wheat crop at the moment. If you have certain associations working with the root system, those plants are resistant to wheat as well. We don't understand the full mechanism, but these are happening. And of course, we need adaptation to extreme events. Stubble, we know, contributes to that. Mulch also, soil organic matter especially, aggregate stability. It's not just erosion through a physical barrier on the surface. Even sometimes your mulch can disappear, but you need the soil to have solid, good, strong aggregate stability, and that comes with organic matter integrated within the soil. And of course, you need your biopore network to give you your drainage as well. So this is what happens, organic matter, you get better aggregate structure, heat, in terms of heat, surface heat, you put your hand underneath your mulch and you know that there's 5-10 degrees difference in terms of temperature. And of course, adaptation to drought, we have, if you're getting water in, you're holding water in, you're basically in business to respond to drought. And water in the soil, as I said, 50% to 60% pore space, half of that is available to hold water. So in a ½ meter soil, we can hold 125 millimeter to 150 millimeter of water. In a meter, you're talking about 250 to 300 millimeter. Now those are water which can survive, which will help survive, crop can survive for many days. You know, so, but if you've got just 10% or 20% pore space working for you, you know you're in trouble very quickly. Also, water, in terms of season, you find that under CA you get higher water content all the time, in many cases, once you get the new equilibrium re-established. Christian's lovely meta-analysis shows that in southern Africa, putting all the data together, the advantages are there in 76% of the time straight away. And over 9 years of analysis, he shows that there is greater stability with CA system. And Pat showed yesterday Dijkstra figure at the bottom, but look at Brazil on the right. Brazil has doubled its maize output and still holding the same area under maize. So a lot of things are happening, and they're doing it with less than, not just 30%, but 50% less fertilizer now. Similarly, in Canada, for example, if you've got 20 years of CA behind you, you build up a lot of organic fertility, and the response to fertilizer is pretty low, and you get better water system. What happened to Brazil River of Tea? This is what happened. So at the large scale level, if you've got CA working for you, and the landscape is stabilized, then that water is now white water. And that is the Itapu Dam, which is the biggest hydroelectric dam we've ever built. Not the biggest dam, but I mean it's the hydroelectric power. And on the left, upper left, you have now that Paraná 3 basin. And the green areas are showing areas which is transformed into CA, and now they are going for high quality CA. And they have a program called Cultivando Agua Boa, a community-based clean water program. They can run this on a CA. You could not run this on tillage-based agriculture. And similarly, carbon sequestration as well. So CA is not only climate smart, it is smart in many other ways. It does offer better weatherproofing, allows large-scale ecosystem services, and so forth. But our disciplinary strength in crop physiology, agroecology, agrometeorology, soil microbiology, system science is extremely weak at the moment. It really is. We lost a lot of disciplinary strength over the last 30 years, and again, our ability to undertake good CA system science research to generate new knowledge is also not strong. Pablo shows the way forward. That was a good piece of work yesterday we heard, but we need a lot more of that work to be done. And then I think that we've seen that when the message gets through, people like to dance. Thank you very much.
I'd like to bid you all good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. I don't see any eminent persons in the front row here this morning, so all protocol will be unobserved. Oh.
They're sitting at the back.
Well, I'd like to take you on a little journey today. A journey into a new world of conservation agriculture, incorporating trees into CA systems and thereby making conservation agriculture evergreen. Let's start by turning to the dire situation that we're confronting. The darkening clouds portending a global climate change catastrophe are on the horizon. Just a little over a year ago, the World Bank published a very significant report trying to estimate and determine what would be the situation for the global economy and agriculture in the event that we do have an increase in average global temperatures of 4 degrees C by the end of the century. It was a catastrophic report. But just a couple of months ago, we learned from new work that's been published in Nature journal that even this estimate looks highly conservative from the standpoint of the new global climate modeling results. And so, in fact, scientists are behind the curve. The situation is looking more and more desperate year by year. And as we've seen in many presentations, we're observing that here in Africa. And so we had better be looking at how we, under these desperate situations, can look outside the box, outside of conventional ways of dealing with our problems of buffering the agriculture systems to climate change, and start looking at some things that are pretty unconventional. But as I'm going to show you, millions of farmers across Africa have taken up this unconventional series of approaches and give us plenty of models in which we can build and adapt to farming systems around the continent. The reason why the situation is looking so increasingly bad is that after 2 decades of discussions and negotiations internationally, carbon emissions are not declining at all. In fact, as you see from this graph, they're accelerating in the past several years. we're not making progress on reducing carbon emissions at the global level. But for those of us in this room, we can pat ourselves on the back perhaps, because in fact, while this is happening at the global level with total emissions, land-based emissions are declining, and they have been steadily declining since the early 1990s. That's the graph on the lower part of this figure. Now, what's happening here? Well, actually, when you look at the balance of carbon emissions from the land, the net balance is actually positive. That is, that although the land-based systems, agriculture and forestry, etc., do emit about 1 picogram of carbon per year, the land is also absorbing about 2.6 picograms per year. In other words, 260% of the emissions that it is emitting. And so land-based systems are actually greening and improving our overall equation at the global level. And this is due to changes in the net primary productivity and many changes on the ground that we're observing in terms of better management of trees in farming systems and in common lands. Now let's take a look at one of those major transformations. Back in the 1980s, after a cycle of very severe droughts, in the Sahel, the tree populations were decimated. And in fact, we were seeing very degraded situations and very desperate people as a result of those conditions. But today, if I took you to places like central Niger, the breadbasket of Niger's agriculture, what you're finding there is a renaissance of tree-based agriculture based on minimum tillage by millions of farm families over millions of hectares. Now, the principle behind this was the simple observation that certain of our indigenous acacia species, such as Phytherba albida, exhibit enormously productive and positive benefits when they're incorporated into agricultural systems. As you can see on these sandy soils in the Sahel, you see dramatic biomass increases of crops like millet and sorghum associated with these trees. One of their unique features is they are dormant during the wet season. That is, they lose their leaves, they drop their leaves at the beginning of the wet season, and they only refoliate at the end of the wet season. So they don't compete with crops for light, nutrients, and moisture. Quite the opposite. They increase infiltration rates according to farmers, lift the water table, and provide an abundant biofertilizer for your crops. Recent data by our friends from CIMMYT have shown this microclimate buffering effect is quite significant. It results in a reduction of canopy temperatures of maize and wheat and other cereal crops of several degrees during the middle of the day, which reduces overradiation, reduces canopy temperatures, increases the length of the grain filling period, and therefore helps to buffer the wheat and maize yield potential under rising temperatures. So African farmers in the Sahel have certainly shown us the way to successfully integrate trees into cropping systems. And the issue is, when will we catch up across the continent to some of the lessons that we're seeing on a large scale? For indeed, in Niger alone, the U.S. Geological Survey recently mapped over 5 million hectares of contiguous medium to high density agroforest systems on millet and sorghum farmlands. That's not a forest that you see there. That is all cropland that farmers have established densities of trees on those lands for their own benefit and the benefit of their families and their farming systems. Now, why are they doing this? Well, they will tell you that not only do they get higher yields of their crops, but they're getting abundant fodder for their livestock in the late dry season, as was emphasized. These are agro-pastoral systems. They are very short of fodder in the dry season. And these trees produce a high protein fodder for livestock. They're getting abundant supplies of fuel wood for the household and for sale. There's now major markets shipping and exporting wood from Niger to Nigeria, of all places, because there is a big surplus of wood due to these 5 million hectares of farmlands covered with trees in Niger. So indeed, this has caused a great change in the whole vision for the future of the Sahel. The natural resource management people at the World Bank and the Global Environment Fund and each of the countries in the Sahel have put together a portfolio of $1.8 billion in sustainable land management practices, projects that are incorporating the farmer-managed natural regeneration of trees on farmland as a fundamental practice for the drylands of Africa. And they're investing in this to scale up, not from the million farmers that are doing it now, but to 5, 10 million farmers over the next decade or so. And what you see here is the plans for the outscaling from the green spots that occur where these systems of agriculture have been regenerating the land over the past couple of decades. Well, moving to East Africa, we find that the same species of trees, Phytherba albida, is common on farms in Ethiopia. And we've estimated about 1 million farms have at least a few of these trees on their farmland. Well, indeed, in the district where the former Prime Minister, Mr. Meles, comes from, the farmland is covered with a beautiful agroforest of Phytherba trees, and he grew up in those situations. And so, when the Minister of Agriculture and he discussed what could be done about developing biosustainability in Ethiopia, he announced at the Climate Change Conference a couple of years ago a new national program to help farmers all over the country to increase the density of their Phytherba trees and take availability, take benefit from the biological resources that the farmers of Ethiopia have known and have protected for many years. But there is an enormous possibility to increase the use of Phytherba in these farming systems. Well, let's now go to southern Africa. And this is one of my favorite pictures from the southern highlands of Tanzania, where farmers are growing beautiful crops of hybrid maize under a canopy of Phytherba albida trees, as you see in this slide, and in fact are now beginning to scale up the use of farmer-managed natural regeneration of these and other trees in the Tanzanian farming systems. But Zambia, as has been mentioned previously, and as Peter Agard and colleagues have emphasized yesterday, Zambia is in the forefront of really building the Phytherba trees into conservation agriculture systems in this country. And I think we'll be seeing some of this on the field trips tomorrow. But these systems are now the conventional way of doing conservation agriculture in Zambia for both mechanized farmers as well as for smallholder farmers using hoe cultivation or oxen for land preparation. The trick is to plant a density of about 100 trees per hectare and to be able to grow those trees successfully into an agroforest which provides the kinds of benefits that you see on this slide here. These are data from the conservation farming units, trials with maize in association with Phytherba all over the maize growing areas of Zambia, and they're getting yields that are often double and some cases triple the yields that would be obtained with conservation agriculture practices in the absence of the Phytherba trees. What the CFU has emphasized is that it's not enough to practice minimum tillage, residue management, and crop rotation. You've got to get more nutrients into the systems. And as Stephen Carr mentioned yesterday, most smallholder farmers find a huge part of their total income in investing in fertilizer. So we need to use the biological resources that are already there. Now, is that so difficult to do? Not at all. As the CFU has developed practices for smallholders to nurture a small nursery of 100 or 125 seedlings per hectare on their farm in the dry season, plant them out in the wet season, and just protect them for a couple of years so that they're not browsed by livestock. and then you have yourself a conservation agriculture system with trees, as you see in this picture here. So there indeed is a system that can be used in the maize-based farming systems across Eastern and Southern Africa, and the CFU is to be congratulated for the tremendous vision and hard work of establishing an indigenous African acacia as a basic component of cropping systems for conservation agriculture. But of course, farming systems are very diverse. And in Malawi, for example, where farms are extremely small and farmers would go for higher biomass production and faster regeneration of nitrogen-fixing trees, there are a number of other options that are practiced now by about a couple of 100,000 farmers in the National Agroforestry Food Security Program. This is one example, the intensive intercropping of Gliricidia with maize systems, which provides, again, not only a massive amount of biofertilizer, but accumulates carbon at the rate of 10 tons per hectare per year of above and below ground carbon, along with fodder and household use of fuel wood and wood products. Indeed, our trials over a couple of decades here in Zambia as well as in Malawi show that there is this gradual but steady increase in the base levels of maize as you use these systems, even in the absence of fertilizers. Now, I'm not arguing against using fertilizers, because a top dressing of nitrogen may be very useful, and certainly phosphorus is important in some agroecosystems. But the biofertilizer prospects are so rich and so inviting. Why don't we use them? Why don't we work harder to integrate them into farming systems and enable farmers to double, triple, or even quadruple their yields over the medium term by developing these kind of systems? I mentioned the National Agroforestry Food Security Program, which is operated by the government of Malawi, the World Agroforestry Center, and a whole range of other organizations, including Total Land Care and others in Malawi. And last year, a review was done, an evaluation of farmers' experience with the fertilizer tree systems. And on the average, again, we saw a doubling of yields as a result of farmer use of these fertilizer trees. Indeed, there are other kinds of combinations. We've been looking at systems that are hybrids between the fast-growing nitrogen-fixing trees like Gliricidia, which can be polarded in the fields, and the slower-growing but full canopy Phythermia trees, which you can establish at wider distances on small-scale farms. The opportunities are rife. Let's us actually get research going, get more experience going in these areas so that we can enrich these national food security programs with good, solid science and excellent farmer experience. And as I mentioned, Malawi is fully committed to scaling this up to all farmers in the country. Currently, they've reached about 200,000 farmers. The ministers of agriculture around the continent are paying notice. They are noticing what's happening, and recently they produced this brochure. This is the cover of a brochure produced by the ministers of agriculture on climate-smart agriculture, with a highlight of the Phythermia systems in maize production right there on the cover, Amir. I was very proud to see that.
Yeah.
I'd like to say a few words about the future of fertilizer subsidies. We had quite a good discussion about that yesterday. I'd like to talk about fertilizer subsidies moving to biosustainability and the recommendations that we have to governments based on this rich research and scaling up experience that I've shared with you, is that ministers ought to consider a gradual shift of input subsidies investments from buying fertilizer and importing it into the country to helping farmers to scale up fertilizer trees and create fertilizer factories in their own fields. Imagine the benefits. It will take time, but let's start now in terms of making that shift of investment, and so there is an exit strategy in the long term for fertilizer subsidies. We can regenerate soils, we can create a sustainable nutrient system, and we can reduce those dastardly fertilizer importation bills that put such a burden on national governments these days. So indeed, we've got to think about local variation, fine-scale variation in the farming systems all across the continent, but we do have models that millions of farmers are practicing and that can provide systems by which we can make those refined judgments on scaling up conservation agriculture and climate-smart agricultural practices. I'd like to spend a minute on another really unconventional idea, but something that could have enormous implications here in Africa, and that's what I call evergreen energy. Do you know that in Sri Lanka, where Gliricidia, the nitrogen-fixing tree, is a national plantation crop, farmers are growing it in various ways in their farming systems, and they are pollarding the trees at about shoulder height every 8 months, selling the fuel wood to the power companies and generating electricity. Meanwhile, they're stripping the leaves for livestock fodder and biofertilizer right there on the farm. In fact, now we have 8 power plants in Sri Lanka that are operating on Gliricidia as a feedstock, either for steam-based turbine generation or pyrolysis gasification, the 2 technologies that are common both there and across Europe these days. And so when we look at evergreen energy systems, we can begin to bring electricity to areas that are off the grid. We can produce, transport fuel via gasification, generate farm income, and many more rural jobs by the production of feedstock for locally based power plants in a grid across the continent. This could propel rural economic growth, improve the outcomes of health and education, and increase our climate change resilience as well. Let's start thinking about evergreen energy. Well, because there's a lot of enthusiasm and work going on to develop these kinds of systems and scale them up across the continent, a number of organizations have gotten together to develop what we call the Evergreen Agriculture Partnership. We're actively engaged in supporting work of governments and non-governmental organizations, civil society, and creating a movement on evergreen agriculture in 17 countries across the continent currently. And as you can see, the systems vary from country to country that are given emphasis. This partnership aims to support governments and other organizations with the information, the capacity, the technology, the high-quality tree seeds, and other inputs that are needed to basically scale up to the millions of farmers that could benefit from these areas. Our overall vision, and this is becoming a global think piece right now, is that the future of agriculture is perennialization. It is, in fact, the integration of woody perennials into agricultural systems, even, Amir, in the Corn Belt of Iowa, where systems of perennialization are being developed as we speak. That is the vision for a truly sustainable planet. Our conclusions. Well, we've seen that the approach to evergreen agriculture and evergreen conservation agriculture has taken root in Africa. It is spreading rapidly. Millions of smallholders are already adopted practices that we would call conservation agriculture with trees, and they are regenerating their soils for long-term sustainability. Many nations are creating the policy and institutional environments to favor adoption, and many on that map are doing strategies for national evergreen agriculture scaling up programs. And finally, I want to mention a very, very significant development. There is in the process of evolving an African CADEP NGO consortium that is committed to reaching 6 million more farmers with climate-smart agriculture practices, including what I've been talking about today, during the next 7 years. I alert you to this because many in this room may want to get more information about this whole consortium and engagement with it as it evolves. It is supported by the NAPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development, the CADEP, the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, the CGIAR, and all of the major development NGOs that have come together to formulate a consortium to be able to make this happen. They're working jointly, they're thinking together, and we're looking to put together a very powerful alliance to suit the needs of scaling up climate-smart agriculture. And so I'd be happy to send more information to anyone that is interested in this subject. And lastly, we've produced a little brief on making conservation agriculture evergreen, and I'll leave some here at the head table for those who may like to get some more information about this subject, and welcome your getting in touch to join what I think is going to be one of the little known, little understood, but most dramatic developments in conservation agriculture in the coming years. Thank you very much.